Hi, everyone. Ooh. All right. Thank you all for coming. Our speaker today is Santiago Legarre, a professor of law at Universidad Católica Argentina. Legarre received his law degree from UCA in 1992 and subsequently earned a Master of Studies in Legal Research from Oxford University and a PhD from Universidad de Buenos Aires. After law school, he clerked for the Argentine Supreme Court. He then started his career in law, teaching at Universidad Austral in 1995. Legarre moved to UCA in 2007. Since 2012, he is also a visiting professor at Notre Dame Law School and at Strathmore Law School in Kenya. In the spring semester, he teaches a class touching on a lot of the subjects upon which he's going to speak today. So please give a round of applause for Professor Legarre.
Thank you, and congratulations on pronouncing my surname pretty well, which is very unusual. Let me share with you how this came to happen. Although I don't know that I'm authorized to do it, I suppose it's the kind of thing that when you're about to tell something you perhaps are not authorized to tell, then maybe people will stop swallowing and look at you for a second. Haley here, who is, I suppose, in charge of the St. Thomas More Society, thought that things ought to be done to make sure that Notre Dame Law School is really a Catholic place. So isn't it ironic that we gather here today to talk about natural law, when the truth is that when I've taught natural law to my students for many years, one of my favorite analogies is that natural law is like the religion of the atheist. But then I'll do my best to try to fit natural law within her very legitimate concern. And I thank her and I thank the group very much for this opportunity to share some time with you and to listen to your thoughts and your questions later on this topic, which I find very interesting and very relevant, one that every law student should care for. And at least I'm pleased to see that there are a few that care for pizza. No, just kidding. I was saying that my analogy, and I'll come back to that, I hope is, or my metaphor is that natural law is the religion of the atheist because, as I will argue briefly, you don't need a faith to sustain the natural law claims. But at the same time, it is true that the Catholic Church embraced natural law thinking. Natural law thinking, as you know, is a pre-Christian thinking, sometimes under other names and sometimes under the name natural law. You're perhaps familiar with the dialogues of Plato and his conversations with the sophists, where they would argue for what today we would call a relativistic point of view, or sometimes today we call it a multicultural relativistic point of view. And he would reply with what today we would call a natural law type of reasoning, arguing that although mores, customs change and are different in Thebes, in Athens, in Ithaca, and so on and so forth, there are some moral truths that are universal, both geographically and also in terms of time. Then, of course, Aristotle is the other pre-Christian champion of natural law thinking, although he uses more in Greek the term natural right, with a very different meaning from the one it has in the natural right tradition in the United States, by the way. But then the church, or rather Christianity, and the fathers first, and more prominently St. Augustine, and much later St. Thomas Aquinas, they bought this idea in the context of the relationship between grace and nature. So if it is true, as it is, that a Jewish person can argue from a natural law point of view, and if it is true, as it is, that there is a book called Natural Law in Judaism, if it is true that another religious, non-Christian person can also argue in natural law terms, if it is true, as it is also true, that someone without a faith can claim that some things, for example, are always wrong, it is also true that Christianity has made a lot of this type of thinking. It has developed it, it has fostered its studies, and indeed from the Middle Ages, Catholic universities have been privileged places of study of natural law. So it does make sense, now I come to say, leaving my joke aside, to think that it has something to do with the Catholicity of an institution, whether natural law matters or not in this institution. If I give you the example of my own university where I'm based, the Pontifical Catholic University of Argentina, when I studied, so law is an undergraduate degree there, and when I studied, it was a 6-year degree, imagine. Now it's a 5-year long degree. And we had 2 required courses where you studied, for the most part, natural law thinking from a historical point of view, and then what is natural law, and then what are the contents of natural law, what are the challenges. In other words, not the kind of thing you might be used to, perhaps, where they tour you through a line of, say, schools of thoughts, where, behold, natural law is number 3, or sometimes number 1, superseded later by better versions of jurisprudence, or maybe it's the last, but in any case, it's one that competes with critical legal studies, economic analysis of law, positivism, you name it, as if this were a school of thought, which essentially it is not. Although, of course, you can develop a school of thought around this reality, and this has happened. Instead, in my school, as I say, we had Introduction to Law in first year, Philosophy of Law in 5th year, both required courses where you would study natural law. And then in separate courses, you had other schools of thought that they could build from, for better or for worse, those premises, sometimes by denying them. I heard in previous visits, as Trenton said, I've come for the last 6 or 7 years in the spring to teach a 1-month course, which I'll do from the beginning of the spring semester for 3 weeks. And I've heard debates here about turning jurisprudence into a non-required class. Maybe you're familiar with this, or maybe it's no longer required, I don't know. I suppose even if you care for jurisprudence, even if you care for natural law, I suppose you could argue for or against, but clearly some of those who argue against, or rather that argue for it not being a required course, they come from the background where, well, this is not really very useful, this is not something that you can have everyone study, as it is really something for those who care for philosophical matters. And I disagree with this, and I'll try in this very brief meeting offering to develop this further in the course that I will do in the spring to argue for that position. You have here in this law school, as perhaps you know, the most prominent student of natural law in the English-speaking world, although if you ask an English-speaking person, the person would probably say that you have here the most prominent student of natural law, full stop. But then that's another story. In any case, he is very prominent. I was very lucky and honored to have my doctoral dissertation supervised by Professor John Finnis, and as you know, he offers a class in the fall on the moral, political, and legal theory of Thomas Aquinas, and then another one more intriguing and less natural law oriented in the spring on Shakespeare. And again, I sometimes find it a bit sad that a Notre Dame law student would go or might go pass through his or her 3 years in law school, as I have attested to, without even knowing this fact I'm talking about, that this person is here, that he can be approached, that you can take a class, that you may think the class is thrilling or boring or whatever, but then you'll be able to tell, you know, your children at least, or maybe take a selfie, I don't know, something depending on the extent of your passion, interest, or whatever it is. Then you have, of course, here the most important, perhaps, journal for the study of natural law in the English-speaking world, or because the language of academia today is English, you could just say, as I said before, the world. This is the American Journal of Jurisprudence, formerly Natural Law Forum. Professor Finnis and Professor Bradley are the editors-in-chief. Both Professor Bradley also teaches here, another very important student of natural law whom you can approach. And then you have this annual event that starts tomorrow. Again, how often it's happened to me, I'm sorry if I sound a bit pessimistic, to talk to a law student here about the so-called fall conference that starts tomorrow, and you know, no clue whatsoever. Maybe it's not the students' fall, maybe it's not advertised, you never know. The reasons don't matter, now you do know. It starts tomorrow evening for 2.5 days, and you know, Professor Bradley, Professor Finnis, Professor McIntyre, Professor Garnett's wife, Professor Sneed, and so on, are all speaking at this conference. It's really good. You have some of the protagonists of these crucial debates coming every year. Professor Robert George from Princeton, and many other famous students of natural law. Natural law, as perhaps you know, is a type of normativity. Normativity that cannot be experimented in the way that you can prove other laws, such as gravity or entropy, or other laws that you can test in a lab with so-called scientific methods. This is why I say it's invisible. It's an invisible type of normativity. It also differs from physical normativity. Physical normativity, many times called natural laws or the laws of nature, which brings a lot of confusion with natural law. Physical normativity, natural laws, is inexorable. If you jump from the 9th floor and as you fall, you say, I don't want to fall, you still fall. This invisible normativity, natural law, which I compare sometimes with a kind of whisper that suggests that what you're about to do is wrong or that you ought to help someone and so on and so forth. Instead, this one is not inexorable. You are free to endorse it, you are free to go for it, and you're also free to resist. So it's not like falling. It's more, if you want, like being virtuous or sinning. You get to choose, you are informed. What is this piece of information? Natural law is this piece of information. And in this talk, I'll only give you like the bright lines. Perhaps some of you don't need them. You don't need even what comes afterwards, but I'm not going to give what comes afterwards today, although I'll suggest some readings for those who would like to, or in this course I'll teach, which is on comparative constitutional law. We will touch on some of that as well. This normativity, invisible, later came to be known, after Plato, Aristotle, many centuries later, came to be known as moral, a moral type of normativity. If you read a book that used to be very popular in college here, After Virtue, by Professor McIntyre, one of the stars, if not the star of the fall conference always, he explains very well that the expression morality, to refer to what the classics called natural law, is very new. But for us, we live in the 21st century, it's easier to understand what I'm talking about if you think of it in terms of morality. So natural law morality, not just any morality, but a certain type of morality that can also be conveniently described as objective critical morality, in that when I say objective, I mean it's not totally dependent on a point of view of any subject, by way of contrast with the so-called relativism, where I say to you, look, this is what I think about lying, but you may think differently, and this is your thought, this is my thought. It's not that you are right and I'm wrong, or I'm right and you're wrong. That doesn't make sense. Instead, with objectivity, it does make sense that with regard to certain statements, claims, moral claims, two persons who differ completely, one of them is in the truth of the matter, the other one is wrong about the matter. Objective critical morality, to distinguish it from conventional morality, moralities, laws also of groups, customs. Societies have certain invisible moral rules as a matter of fact. In some, for example, in Kenya, where I visit often, it is seen morally okay, morally, but not from the critical point of view, but the conventional point of view, that if your cousin comes to visit with you, you offer your cousin one of your several wives so that your cousin will have an agreeable evening during the visit. Well, I thought you might laugh, but it's not so funny, really, but it's true then. Right. So-called positivism is another way of denying the existence of an objective critical morality and then of natural law, insofar as some versions of positivism hold that the only source of fairness, of justice, is either a contract, convention, or a posited human enactment, law, enacted by a legislature or by a judge, depending on the structure of a given constitutional system. Instead, according to Plato, Aristotle, and the Christian philosophers, there is another source of justice and of fairness, a pre-existing, in terms not of time, but in terms of import, source of justice, which is precisely natural law. Now, all this was very clear for those ancient philosophers and then for the medieval philosophers. But with changes in thought, starting with empiricism and later with what McIntyre calls emotivism, natural law becomes like angels, the kind of thing that you either believe in because you have a faith, or show me an angel. If you can show me an angel, then I will believe that natural law is a real thing, objective and so on. Because for empiricism, the only true thing is something that I can touch, that I can test in a lab. In this context, the study of natural law is considered a non-scientific thing, and it's like banned and thrown away, especially from law schools that become law schools like a lab where you study, people even think there isn't such a great difference between doing engineering and doing law school, lots of technicalities. And this is partly true, but it is also sad in that the contents of all those techniques, of all those laws, are moral, and that's where natural law comes into play. In the late 20th century, especially in the United States, there has been a revival of the study of natural law. Professor Finnis is one of the key actors of this revival. And those who are part of this revival, himself, his master, Professor Germain Grisset, his main disciple, Professor Robert George, Professor Bradley, whom I mentioned, Professor William May, and several others, they were all studied by a doctoral student in Notre Dame in the late 80s who labeled them the new natural law or the new natural lawyers. And he wrote his dissertation, Professor Russell Hittinger did, with the title The New Natural Law Theory, published by the University of Notre Dame Press in 1987. This has now become the way in which everyone refers to this revival, which is very ironic because Hittinger, when he branded these guys with this title, what he meant to do was to criticize them and to hold that these guys were betraying the classical tradition of Plato, Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas. But then again, that's for another day. That's another story. Finnis, in a recent article, I think for the first time, has come to accept that there is some sense to the terminology new natural law, because he says the natural law theory that Aquinas and I, says he, hold is indeed new with regard to Plato and Aristotle, so new natural law theory. But then that's not what Hittinger meant when he used the label. Interestingly, I think in his big book, Natural Law, Natural Rights, published in 1980, Finnis hardly ever uses the word natural law. He purposefully tries to avoid as much as he can, and he succeeds, to use the word natural law because so many confusions exist these days around the term natural law. I'll mention three only, and I'll make some publicity for a paper I've sent to the Louisiana Law Review, or rather it was a lecture titled A New Natural Law Reading of the Constitution, where I explain in more detail these three sources of confusion. One I've already mentioned, and that is the physical natural laws, the fact that we call often natural law each one of the single physical natural laws, so the natural law of gravity, and this is a source of confusion. And then many people think that the natural law I am talking about today has to do with the greens or nature or conservation, which is all very fine, but has almost nothing to do with natural law. Then secondly, of course, this is so common, there is the confusion that because the Catholic Church has embraced natural law thinking, then natural law is for the believer, and it's indeed a Catholic concept. And this is when I come with the religion of the atheist idea, which I indeed borrow from the letter of St. Paul to the Romans, where he says that the Gentiles who do not have the law, meaning the Abrahamic, not Abrahamic, the Mosaic law, they still know that, for example, killing is wrong, although they don't know the commandment. So he argues from there in favor of a natural law type of reasoning where faith doesn't come into the picture. Thirdly, another source of confusion is that in US constitutional doctrine, there is the so-called natural law jurisprudence. So, for example, this is how the dissenters in both Lochner and Griswold v. Connecticut refer to the majority's opinions there. They refer to that derisively as natural law, meaning, for example, Justice Black in Griswold, meaning a kind of doctrine where you ignore the Constitution, the text of the Constitution, in favor of morality, of a higher law. Where the truth is that when it comes to classical natural law, positive law, constitutions, enactments, contracts are crucial, totally. Natural law theory is not about replacing positive law with natural law, not at all. But then that's a third source of confusion, that this idea of replacement comes with the label natural law jurisprudence. It's being very criticized and very rightly criticized. But unfortunately, then the name natural law fell together with that terrible doctrine. Right. I'll mention, to start wrapping up, 3 ways in which natural law can be interpreted and in which it can come into play with regard to law in general, to constitutional law, and to law school. 3 different ways. So the 3 assume the reality of an objective critical morality, but they are very different, these 3. In the first one, which I will call an individualistic interpretation of natural law, the first one is like the antipodes of the philosophy of John Stuart Mill, where John Stuart Mill would say that for the individual, there isn't a morality. Morality only exists in the social domain, and it's judged by the harm principle. But then the individual, he's guided what he called prudential considerations, which basically means whatever is more or less convenient for himself or for herself. But you can never say that there is something wrong or right unless the person is interacting. This, from a natural law perspective, is incorrect, and the individualistic position holds indeed the opposite. Why the opposite? Because it says there are objective moral truths, but they only guide the individual. They are irrelevant for the social life. So to speak, this is like the liberal claim that religion, or morality in this case, is for the home. But then don't bring to the public arena the notion that cloning is wrong. Just don't clone yourself, or lying, or whatever. So in other words, it's the denial that they are the same principles, moral principles, that rule the private sphere and the public sphere. And therefore, for law, if this is natural law, for law, natural law is totally irrelevant. And there are many people who hold this. I totally buy the natural law idea, but just for me. I can't impose, so to speak, these on others. Then there is a second way in which natural law can come into play. These are the drawings by my nephew and godson, I realize now. The second one I call positivist, and interestingly is the one that, for example, Justice Scalia would embrace as I read him, although he would totally think that natural law rules the individual, and he would also think that it rules social choices, and it's very relevant for policy. He would say the relevance finishes when a certain policy receives enactment by, say, Congress or a legislature. So that when it comes to the judge or the justice of the Supreme Court, natural law is completely irrelevant. When you're about to legislate about something, yes, you need to know, you need to inquire morally, is this right, is this wrong? But then when you're a judge, you just need to do a mechanical kind of thing, you know? You just search for the meaning of, I don't know, persons in the 14th Amendment, what did it mean in the dictionaries in 1867 or whatever it is, and then that's it, you're bound by that. This is like a second way in which natural law comes into play, so it comes more into play than in the first version, but it's limited, as you see, because then when you become a judge, you're done. And then comes, I didn't have a name for the third one, so I called it the real thing, where the real thing shares with the so-called positivist view of natural law the notion that there is guidance both for the private sphere and for the public sphere. So if it's wrong for me to go for an abortion, it is also wrong for my community, for my society, and I'll try to do my best to incorporate that into legislation. But this third view considers that natural law also has traction when it comes to interpreting already posited, enacted law. But, and again, I'll be very brief here, and I can refer you to readings, and I'll stay for a few minutes if you don't have to run and want to ask me in person for more. And then there is my course again, the course that will not deal with this mainly, but because I think what justifies comparative constitutional law is precisely the universality explained by natural law. Therefore, we deal partly with natural law in that course as well. Anyways, I was going to say that the traction of natural law for positive law and for the interpretation of positive law varies depending on what areas of law we're talking about. That's my argument here. So Thomas Aquinas considered that every single just law is connected to natural law in one of two different ways, which he called, I'll be very brief again, and I'm sorry, derivations by way of conclusion and derivations by way of determination, by which he meant that, say, for example, the law of bankruptcy, certain precepts in that federal act are connected to natural law, derived, he would say, from natural law in a very loose way, which he called by way of determination, where natural law tells you when someone goes bankrupt, there has to be a fair distribution of the remaining property among the creditors, but doesn't give you any concrete solution, and the legislator has to determine, hence derivation by way of determination. Now, when it comes to interpreting an area of the law that is this, and I think that most of the law is like this, then the traction of natural law, I argue, is at its lower point. But it is still there because any just enactment has some connection with some human good, with something that promotes the common good in one way or other. And therefore, you will need to understand the point of this determination. It's what today is called by some of the new natural law students the why question. Why is this enactment in the bankruptcy law in my example like this? When you go to the why, then you are with the universal question. But then there are other sectors in criminal law and in constitutional law and in family law especially that have a more direct connection, which Thomas calls derivation by way of conclusion, by which he means that you can trace the enactment, say, a law against euthanasia, assuming there is one, and where there is one, the connection of this law with a pre-existing moral precept that tells you exactly the same that this law that by hypothesis prohibits euthanasia is telling you. So the law is telling you you ought not to do this legally, but morality already told you you ought not to do this morally. Now here, the connection is like more clear, more direct. You still need to fill many gaps. You will need to provide for a punishment for the circumstances, alleviating, and so on and so forth. Finally, there is a circumstance where an enactment is neither a derivation by way of conclusion nor a derivation by way of determination, but rather it is an enactment that violently departs from natural law or contradicts it, and this is what is known as an unjust law. And again, the only way to, or not the only way, but a significant way to consider a law unjust is from this point of view of natural law. If you only hold that there is a conventional morality, it's hardly possible to call something immoral. Whatever is what it is, it's moral. So the road ahead would be to go into the details to understand better what is natural law, what are the difficulties in getting to know it and to know some things, some other things. Is everything the same? Why do people disagree so much? What happens in this fragmented world? What happens with the challenge that someone who is very sympathetic with natural law, like Professor McIntyre, poses to natural law theory, namely, this is not the Middle Ages, now everyone disagrees about everything. We think we are in agreement, we're talking about the same words, but we mean different things. So these are the things that need to be dealt with when you study natural law in these courses that you're lucky to have and that I was lucky to have. I said I would offer some readings. The book Natural Law, Natural Rights is a very challenging, difficult reading, so I recommend it for those of you who want a challenge or who are up to something really difficult. If you want something simpler, Professor George, for example, has written several easier versions of the same. There is, I believe, in the internet an article by Professor William May called Legislating Morality. I think if you Google May Legislating Morality, you find it, where the first part is a very simple explanation of natural law. Or then you can wait for a little bit and read my own piece that has a second section called Natural Law for Dummies, or take my class, although you're not a dummy, and then you'll read it for the class. Thank you so much. I'll take some questions. If there are questions, sure.
Thank you very much for the talk. So my question was, I come from an environment where I have been studying law from a very positivist point of view. When you go to introduction to the law, the first thing you see is that there's law and there's morality. There are two different normative systems that regulate human conduct. And from a positivist point of view, they are separate. So there are certain things that might go against a person's moral values, but still not be prohibited. They might be regulated by morality, but not by law. So my question is, from a natural law point of view, would that be possible, or is there a complete overlap between morality and law?
Thank you. That's a great question. So when the second way I described in which natural law can come into play, depending on how you interpret it, when it claims that the same moral principles rule your private conduct and rule the conduct of people who interact with each other in community, that position is not suggesting that positive law should ban whatever is wrong. On the contrary, The classical natural law tradition, and in this, my second and third interpretation, they would share this. In other words, the Scalia interpretation and the third one, which I hold correct, they would be in agreement in this. There is a famous dictum by Thomas Aquinas where, to the question, ought human law to suppress all vices, he gives a resounding no. So there isn't a total overlap in answer to your question, and the law does and ought to leave untouched, I would say, most of morality. As Thomas, if you look at the examples he gives of the kinds of things that human law should deal with, they are the really bad things. But there are many other things that are really immoral that the law should never touch because, among other reasons, it would act, I have an elephant here, it would act like an elephant in a small place, like destroying things that are very valuable in order to perhaps try to achieve some moral good, but it's out of the jurisdiction of the government and of the state. Yeah.
You spoke about how, I'm from South Africa, we emailed each other, but you spoke about how there's a trend to get rid of jurisprudence. Well, you said here, I don't know if that's a general trend in the US, but I find that quite peculiar because my law school back home is they say it's very important that a jurisprudence course is incredibly important. Do you know why this trend's coming about, why this questioning is happening? Because I've been in practice, I've done a couple of things, and I found one of the most useful courses were not the positive courses where we learned the rules about company law, but actually the sort of foundational reasons as to why we have law and stuff. So I was wondering if you had any idea where this sort of anxiety towards having a compulsory course is coming from.
Yeah, nice to meet you in person. I can speculate. I think that partly it has to do with a broader trend away from including theory in the law school. And it is a trend, as you, I'm sure, are aware, towards offering more clinical stuff, more practical stuff, more things that will make you more able in the market and in theory will give you more chances to find a job more quickly and so on. And I suppose there is this suspicion that this is an utter waste of time, so you hardly offer it and you certainly don't require it, and you hire less people who will know how to teach it, and then no one will know how to teach it. And this will become, probably it will become what will happen. It is now what happens in most places. I think it's sad because if I am right that the third variant is the correct one, and even if the second one is correct, and even if the first one is correct, then anyone should care for natural law. Well, in the first one, to educate your children, you can say, well, for that I go to the synagogue, okay, or to church. But then to legislate, to adjudicate, I think it's so crucial. And then as a mea culpa, I would say, there is also the problem that so much boring and useless stuff has been taught in jurisprudence courses. So students many times, sometimes they're right to be wanting to be somewhere else, like watching a show or something when they teach them this kind of course. You need to do it, you need to deal with the real problems, with the real thing, and sometimes you need to be, I think it goes along those lines. Yeah.
What does it look like for a judge to employ the third method? Because it seems like today, if you're a judge, you can't take any sort of like conservative values into account when making a decision, but you're free to take, more what you call more like liberal values into account, like in the Obergefell decision or something. That if you do have those, you just can't let that come into your calculation of the judge. So how does a judge employ that?
Thank you. I would say first, it's important to stress that natural law is not a partisan concept. It has nothing to do with being democratic, conservative, Republican, liberal. Very important. In fact, it's easier to argue for many natural law claims from what are some liberal points of view, but then that's another long story. It has to do with the idea that some liberal notions are more, so to speak, against the positivist view. And secondly, it's interesting now with the nomination process of your professor, Amy Barrett, who would have liked to swing by, she said, to say hello, but then she's so busy these days. These problems came up, and of course you're right. And I think it's important that it's not the names that you're using when you're writing a decision or when you're arguing before a court, but the type of argument you're doing. Natural law is not about names. You can call your argument a natural law argument, and that won't be a natural law argument if it's not. And then you can decide not to call it to avoid counter reactions given a cultural context, and then do the real thing. So you just play smart within the law. I mean, there are only very extreme situations, which I refer to as an unjust law, where you need to get out of the system. Amy Barrett had to deal with this during her nomination. She was talking about recusing herself in some cases. Others would prefer to be maybe impeached. But then this is really extreme. I'm not saying there aren't extreme cases, but then there's the huge bulk of the cases where a fair legal system needs to be interpreted. Then you don't need to say natural law, natural law, natural law, but you need to try to dig deep and understand what is there behind the veil of the law. The law is like the clothes, but then what's the body? Yeah.
You were talking about at the beginning of the lecture about natural law being the religion of atheists or something like that. Is there anything that Christianity or the Christian tradition brings over and above just kind of Platonic, rational deduction and stuff to the understanding of what natural law is and how it operates in the world?
The answer, in my opinion, or as arrogant people tend to say, in my humble opinion, is yes, there is. So natural law is, I think, the religion of the atheist, and my atheist uncle always acts according to natural law, and he's proud of that. But if you are lucky enough to know more and to have a faith, then you will have an answer to some questions my uncle doesn't find an answer to, and he doesn't care because he's such a good guy. For example, why is there so much evil around what happened in Texas? Or why is our knowledge of what is right and what is wrong faulty? Why do we sometimes sincerely think that something is right when indeed it is wrong? You can only understand that, for example, to give you this example, if you understand the doctrine of original sin and of sin that explains to you, but then you need a faith to believe this, that intelligence was weakened as a result of, and then the passions, then you may know what you ought to do, but you prefer not to because it's more convenient to. And then there are the very difficult moral questions. So for my uncle, it's very clear that to cheat is wrong, and he doesn't do it. But then there are some situations where there is a true moral answer, but when you have the torch, the further torch that the church, a church provides you, then you can fill several gaps that with the light of natural law only, with the whisper only, you may be like a little bit in the darkness. You know, you need to decide now. You've been married for 7 years and you would like to have children, and they offer you this alternative. They will freeze some embryos you have the facts more or less clear, but then is what I'm going to do right or wrong? I mean, thank God my uncle is 75 and he's not going to have children or that problem, but he would be in trouble with the religion of the atheist to come to a... And then there is grace too, because you may know very well that you ought to be faithful to your wife, but then now your wife is crippled and she's not beautiful anymore, and your partner is, and she isn't crippled and she is keen, and so on. So you may know what you ought to do, but again, then Christianity in a different way, or God actually, can assist you in a way that Cicero won't. Right, I think it's time. I'll stay for a few minutes. Thank you so much for your attention.